the abandonment of the self is an aspect of complex trauma. And learning to actually love yourself is part of the healing and recovery process. Hi, this is Jim Breon. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and also a licensed professional clinical counselor in Orange County, California. What I'm going to be talking about today is healing from complex trauma. We've talked on this channel before about complex trauma, various types of trauma, part of a series we're doing on trauma. And I did talk about complex trauma, complex PTSD in a previous episode and kind of glazed over the healing process. So I wanted to go a little more in depth on the healing process when a person has complex trauma. Now, trauma is something that many people may be familiar with in terms of PTSD, or what we think of as shock trauma, being in a war situation or a terrible car accident or a physical assault or a sexual assault. Complex trauma is what happens when a person is exposed to chronic, repeated traumatizing experiences, overwhelming experiences, and these often begin in childhood. That's why complex trauma is often referred to as interpersonal trauma or developmental trauma. And what is traumatizing for one person may not be traumatizing for another person based on lots of individual differences, including temperament, personality, social support. But mainly CPTSD or complex trauma is interpersonal. It's what happens in relationships and often between parents and children as they're growing up. And some of the ways that we identify complex trauma are when people have what we think of as emotional flashbacks. They can be triggered by something in the current moment and emotionally be overwhelmed and feel like you almost regress to an earlier state where you're paralyzed by fear, confusion, sadness, feelings of abandonment. And the abandonment of the self is an aspect of complex trauma because many people with CPTSD have lived with toxic shame. They really kind of abandon themselves. They feel internally worthless often and don't feel like their needs matter. They might even lose their ability to ask for what they need, or they learn how to do that in ways that actually push people away and keep them from getting their needs met. And what happens is the development of the self is disrupted. In other words, we can often develop a false self or different false selves or role selves, and we abandon the true self because the process of individuation is disrupted. People that struggle with complex trauma often have a very harsh internal critic that beats up on them and tells them that they're worthless. And people living with complex trauma often struggle in relationships and even feeling comfort from relationships, and often have tremendous anxiety, often social anxiety. Another thing that happens with people when we're looking through the lens of complex trauma is that people have developmental arrests. In other words, their emotional, sometimes even cognitive development can be arrested. And some of those areas that happen with complex trauma, and not for everyone, but often there's an emotional disruption in learning how to regulate your emotions, how to soothe yourself, take care of yourself emotionally, how to experience your emotions, let them come, but let them go. And there's a nervous system dysregulation that happens. People might even struggle just with basic things like relaxation, like feeling safe and comfortable in the present moment. And the development of this sense of self or identity can be arrested. The process that we think of it as individuation can be arrested. In lots of ways, there are developmental blocks when it comes to developing healthy self-esteem, learning self-care, self-compassion, and even self-protection. And the capacity for a person to fully express themselves is often hindered and arrested. And like I mentioned, the ability to actually take comfort in relationships can really be arrested. This is what we think of as often attachment disruptions. So the healing process is a journey. It's something that happens in stages. It's not something that happens overnight, and it can be difficult. Many times when a person is working on recovery from complex trauma, sometimes it feels like it gets worse before it gets better. But it is worth the journey. And the journey begins on the cognitive level, as far as cognitive therapy, understanding how our thoughts and feelings drive our behaviors, and developing a new kind of narrative for your life, for your trauma, for what happened, creating a new story, and developing awareness through psychoeducation, understanding exactly how these things happened is crucial. Whether it's understanding that you grew up with an abusive parent, or maybe an emotionally immature parent, or a narcissistic parent, a parent that had severe mental illness themselves, or maybe an addiction, or maybe a combination, some of those things. And when we can develop the awareness and understand the origins of the trauma, we can learn how to pass it back, so to speak, rather than passing it on for another generation. It's important to learn to disidentify with that inner critic and with the false self, and to develop a stronger sense of the authentic self. That sounds very easy, but it's actually a process that can be very difficult and confusing, and often something that you need help with a therapist who is trauma-informed and understands attachment. There's a process that we go through of reparenting ourselves, developing a healthier ego, learning to respond to ourselves the way we wish our parents had been able to respond to us. So rather than being vindictive and shaming towards yourself, you learn compassion towards yourself. And this is where the idea of mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness is really crucial in healing from complex trauma. Mindfulness in terms of being able to remain in the present moment on purpose, rather than getting caught up into your thoughts and driven by your emotions, either forecasting anxiety into the future or reliving the past in ways that lead to sadness, depression, disconnection. And often our minds can be like a pendulum that goes back and forth between those two, worrying and regretting. So mindfulness is a way of bringing you back into the present moment. And exploring mindfulness involves also learning radical acceptance and self-compassion. Radical acceptance is learning to accept the things that I can't change, to change the things that you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It sounds very much like the Serenity Prayer from Alcoholics Anonymous. Radical acceptance is learning to recognize that there are some things that I really don't like it the way that it is, and I can't change it. So I'm going to alleviate my suffering by dropping my resistance to it. Again, this is a simple concept to talk about, but a much more difficult thing to put into practice, as is self-compassion, learning how to treat yourself with the same kind of kindness that you would a good friend or somebody you truly love. And learning to actually love yourself is part of the healing and recovery process. It involves emotional healing and developing greater emotional intelligence. It means healing from toxic shame, that internalized sense that there's something wrong with me, that I'm not worthy. It means recovering your emotional nature, really sort of learning how to get back in touch with your own emotions, which you may have learned how to dissociate from, or to neglect or suppress. And a huge part of the healing process is grieving the loss of the relationships that you wished you'd had, and the realization that those times can never be redone, and that you have to let go in order to move on. And then finally, I think it's a spiritual healing process that we have to go through, because often that aspect of our lives is arrested as well, as far as feeling a sense of spirituality, feeling a sense of connection to something greater than just yourself. And when you feel that connection, you feel like you're in a sense of flow, like your life makes sense. So again, this is just a short video talking about the long and often arduous process of healing from complex trauma. But I did want to talk about what it looks like to go through that process. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are and welcome comments and conversations that we can start in the comment section. And if the videos are helpful, I encourage you to like, subscribe, sign up for notifications so we can let you know when more material is coming out. And in the meantime, take care of yourself and take care of one another. Bye-bye.